that is being worked on now.
The City of Ottawa then had adequate financial funds to deal with the protest?
Yes, we did. We have healthy reserve funds.
So the only issue was actually getting bodies, right?
Well, getting bodies, yes, but also having the Emergencies Act so that we could get tow trucks and we could have a plan in place that once the police moved in, we could actually move those trucks that refused to move and tow them to a central location.
I just caught something you said. You said you wanted the Emergencies Act.
Yes.
You needed it to get the tow trucks.
Well, we needed something to get the tow trucks because we were not successful. So when the Emergencies Act was introduced, and it was made clear specifically one line that towing was one of the requirements that people could not say no to, that was a big win for us in the City of Ottawa.
And I take it, Mr. Mayor, that you have, of course, a relationship with probably numerous members of Parliament from your position as mayor in Ottawa, right?
Correct, yes.
Right. Did anybody tell you before the Emergencies Act was invoked that it was coming?
No.
All right. So you didn't know if you were going to get these powers or what have you were going to be ordered with respect to towing vehicles?
No, when the act was introduced and my staff basically printed off a copy of the act and highlighted those sections that we could use. The one that caught my attention the first was the towing capacity to clean up the situation in Centertown and Byron Market.
So you do know, and you've already mentioned that, of course, the Ottawa Police Service Board is independent of the police service, the Ottawa Police Service, and they have no ability to order operational sort of orders or bylaws, right?
Yes, they don't pass bylaws, but...
And as the former Minister of Municipal Affairs, you also know that, of course, the province of Ontario and the Premier and the ministers at the provincial level, they have no ability to order the OPP to do anything with respect to resources either.
That's correct.
Right. So you know these two things, right? And you knew them at the time.
Yes.
Right. And it would have been the commissioner of the OPP that would be making those decisions, right?
Yes, he was in contact with Chief Slowly.
Right. And at no time, and that's Mr. Thomas Carrerick, is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. And you agree with me that at no time while you were looking for these resources did you contact the commissioner of the OPP to outline what you wanted, right?
No, that would be inappropriate.
That would be inappropriate.
To contact an OPP officer.
He's the commissioner of the OPP. What's the difference? You're okay with having contact with the Prime Minister of the country, but you're not okay having contact with the commissioner of the OPP to ask him for what you need.
Because we have a system in place where we do not have politicians interacting directly with police officers or superintendents or commissioners. That would be highly inappropriate. That's why, as a politician, my counterpart is not the OPP commissioner, it's the Premier and the Minister responsible for the Solicitor General. So it would be highly inappropriate. During this whole period, I did not once speak to the Commissioner of the OPP or the Commissioner of the RCMP. Completely inappropriate. So, you know, I dealt at the political level with members of Parliament, members of provincial Parliament, ministers, and the Premier and the Prime Minister. That was my role in this period in our city's history.
Okay, and did you have phone calls with the Minister of Justice and the Premier with respect to what you needed?
Well, we had discussions with the Solicitor General and the Premier, and at the federal level, it was the Minister of Emergency Preparedness and Public Safety and the Prime Minister.
Right. And so, again, just in your statement that you provided, I didn't see when the dates were that you had these conversations with the Premier. When were they? What were the dates?
Well, I'll have to look them up. I don't recall what they are, but I believe it was in, it was 2 or 3 during the month of, I believe, February. February.
So
I stand to be corrected, but I don't know the specific dates. But the Prime Minister's office did provide a quasi-transcript, so we have the specifics on that. But these calls that I had with the Premier were, one of them was basically he called me on my cell phone. We had a long discussion about the situation that was on the ground, And then the other was when the Minister of the Solicitor General joined us and we had a discussion about the need for OPP officers.
Okay, so, and I can tell you that the Prime Minister and the Premier were talking around that time too. And the Premier had told the Prime Minister, and I'm going to put it to you that he also told you, that he had no ability to order the OPP to provide you officers. It had to come from the Commissioner and the OPP themselves, right?
Right.
Right, and he told you that.
I don't know if he told me that, but the Solicitor General sent a letter, as we saw earlier today, indicating that she had sent our request, the letter that Councillor Deans and I sent to the Premier and the Solicitor General. She had sent that to the Commissioner of the OPP, which is the proper route, not telling him what to do, indicating that this request has come in and to please take the appropriate action.
Right, and the Premier told you that he wouldn't join the tripartite meetings because it was pointless.
He felt it was a waste of time.
Right, and it was.
How do you know that?
Because you were looking for officers, and they couldn't order officers.
No, that's, I don't think you fully understand the situation, that I can't pick up the phone and start barking orders at a commissioner of any police service, whether it's the OPP or the RCMP. There's a protocol in place, and that protocol is to have politician to politician. And the RCMP and the minister said the same thing. He can't direct Commissioner Leckie, but he can certainly pass along our request. And she made the decision, and we thank her and the Commissioner because at the end of the day, they did provide the resources that ended up cleaning up this terrible situation our residents found themselves in.
Right, and this protocol that you've been talking about and mentioned, is it in writing?
Well, it's the law that politicians are not allowed to direct police services. It's very...
I understand that, but there's nothing that I know of, at least, and if you could point me to it, that says that you were prevented from either calling Commissioner Leckie or calling the Commissioner of the OPP and saying, hey, we need some more resources. Can you do this?
Again, I think that would be entirely inappropriate, you know, to give the powers of operational responsibilities to politicians is a very
I'm not saying that,
slippery
sir.
slope.
I'm asking you if there's an actual policy that says you are not allowed to call and make a request to the police. Is there a policy in that regard?
Well, our city solicitor advised that the route that we should be taking is the letter to the Premier and the Prime Minister and the two appropriate
Okay, so
ministers.
it wasn't a protocol. It was what the city solicitor told you to do.
Well, I'm assuming that he would have told me what to do based on the law of the land. And
Okay.
the policy is very,
I'll ask
very
him
clear.
about that when he testifies.
Sure.
The other questions I have for you have to do with the mediator. Now, you had asked the
Sorry, with what?
The mediator. Right. You had asked the federal government if they could appoint an independent mediator. Is that right?
Yes,
And the federal government said no.
that's correct.
Right. And they said no because they didn't want to look like they were engaging with the protesters. Is that right?
You'd have to ask them. I can't speculate why, although, as you know, there was a movement on the same day by two colleagues on council to bring a resolution to council to ask the federal government to allow a mediator to try to find a middle ground. That motion never made its way onto the council agenda, so
Right.
the council didn't take a position.
You said that you had no issues with financial resources at the time. So why didn't you just hire a mediator?
Well, again, the issue that the protesters were in Ottawa was not to protest the city of Ottawa, but federal and provincial mask mandates, among other issues that the truckers were upset with. So it was not really up to the city to start that kind of a broad-based mediation. What we did do, and what we were somewhat successful, was to secure an agreement by Ms. Leach and those truckers who fell under her jurisdiction, for lack of a better term. And I believe that was successful. We were able to get 40 big rigs and about 60 smaller ones out of the residential area and onto Wellington Street.
Right.
So that was not mediation. That was an individual, Mr. French, who came forward and offered at no charge the ability to see if there was some common ground between our police service and the protesters. But in terms of why the federal government didn't want to deal with a mediator, you'd have to ask them.
So Mr. French steps forward, he says, I can help, and he finds some common ground and was going back and forth, of course, between the city and the protesters.
Yes.
So he mediated the issue.
Well, he was a facilitator because he ended up getting a letter from me and then a subsequent response from Ms. Leach. And the activities took place, I think, the next day, and then they were halted once the Emergencies Act was implemented, I believe, on the 14th.
Right. And after that agreement was done, the protesters followed the agreement and tried to get on to Wellington, and the only thing that ended up stopping them was the police. Is that correct?
No, the police were there actually to help facilitate and traffic manage the congestion to bring them on to Wellington Street and away from the residential areas. So a senior officer was assigned, and my understanding was that it worked quite well, and then the Emergencies Act basically put a halt to that because all resources for police were needed to clear the area the following days.
I put it to you that after the Emergencies Act was invoked, and you may have heard some of this evidence yesterday, that there was just a change, and that it was the city who decided not to follow through with the agreement with the protesters, and that was what happened with respect to that agreement.
No, I believe that we did our best to live up to the agreement, and as did the truckers who did move, and we appreciate that. Because that was the first time, as you know, where there'd been any kind of movement on the ground. There was a level of frustration. There was more and more rowdyism that was taking place in the streets of Ottawa. And we felt, as my #1 preoccupation was to protect those residents who had been putting up with horn honking 24 hours a day, diesel fumes that were coming into their apartments and condominiums, and general unruliness where people were afraid to leave their homes.
Right. And so you would agree then these statements that have been out by various people that the protesters did not live up to the agreement are incorrect. In fact, they did.
So I'm not sure who you're referring to.
There's been numerous, it's okay, but you agree that the protesters lived up to their end of the bargain, right?
On that particular issue, yes.
Right. And you had earlier said in your evidence that, you know, you couldn't